My name's Adele Fontaine. I'm 30, and I want to start with the exact moment I stood on my own porch, 3 days after being discharged from the hospital, and realized my key didn't work anymore. I stood there for a solid minute, jiggling that key in the lock, convinced I was somehow doing it wrong, before I finally accepted what was actually happening. Someone had changed the locks on my own house while I was lying in a hospital bed, recovering from emergency surgery. That's when my neighbor, Winona, came out onto her porch next door, saw me standing there confused, and walked over holding something in her hand. "Adele, honey, I think you're going to need this," she said, and pressed a key into my palm. I looked down at it, completely confused. "Winona, what is this?" "Your mother-in-law gave it to me last week," she said, her voice careful, like she already knew this conversation was going to go somewhere complicated. "Said if you came home while she wasn't around, I should let you in, but only if you were," and I'm quoting her here, "in the right state of mind to be back in that house." I stood there on my own porch, holding a spare key to my own home, given to my neighbor by my mother-in-law, who apparently had appointed herself the gatekeeper of whether I was mentally fit enough to enter my own house. But to understand how we got to that porch, to that key, to that entire surreal moment, you need the full picture first, because this didn't happen in isolation. This had been building for months, and honestly, longer than that if I'm being fully honest with myself. I married my husband, Silas Fontaine, 4 years ago. We bought a house together in a suburb outside Richmond, Virginia, a modest 3-bedroom place we'd both worked hard to afford, proud of building something that was genuinely ours from the ground up. My name is on that deed, jointly with Silas, equally, something I want to be very clear about from the start, because it matters enormously for what happened later. Silas's mother, Adele, and I had a complicated relationship from almost the very beginning. Not openly hostile, not the kind of mother-in-law conflict you see dramatized in movies with screaming matches and slammed doors. Ours was quieter, more insidious in a way. Adele had very specific ideas about how a wife should behave, how a household should be run, ideas that consistently seemed to position me as somehow inadequate compared to whatever standard she'd internalized over the years. Usually some version of comparison to how she'd run her own household decades earlier. Things had gotten harder over the past year specifically, because I'd been struggling with my mental health in ways I wasn't always great at hiding, even when I tried to. Generalized anxiety that had gotten progressively worse, exacerbated by a stressful job change, and some ongoing fertility struggles Silas and I had been quietly dealing with for almost 2 years by that point. I'd started therapy about 8 months before everything that happened with the locks, working through things with a genuinely excellent counselor, making real, if slow, progress. Adele knew about the anxiety, in a general sense, because Silas had mentioned it to her at some point, probably trying to explain why I seemed more withdrawn at certain family gatherings, or why I'd occasionally needed to step outside during particularly overwhelming moments. What Adele did with that information, though, over the following months, was start subtly, then not so subtly, framing my mental health struggles as evidence of some deeper instability, something that made me, in her private assessment apparently, less capable of properly managing a household or a marriage. I found out later, piece by piece, that she'd been having private conversations with Silas about this, expressing concerns that I might be more trouble than he bargained for, suggesting at one point that maybe he should reconsider whether the marriage was actually sustainable, given what she perceived as my ongoing instability. Silas, to his credit, generally pushed back on these conversations when they happened, defended me, told her repeatedly that my anxiety wasn't the crisis she seemed to think it was. But he also, I think, in ways I didn't fully understand until much later, occasionally let those seeds sit longer than he probably should have, not directly agreeing with his mother, but also not shutting the conversations down as firmly or as quickly as I would have wanted, had I known they were happening at all. Then, about 6 weeks before the locks got changed, I had a genuinely serious medical emergency. A ruptured appendix that had gone undiagnosed for longer than it should have, partly because some of the early symptoms had overlapped confusingly with anxiety symptoms I was already managing, leading me to initially dismiss the pain as just another flare-up rather than something requiring immediate medical attention. By the time I finally went to the emergency room, the infection had progressed to something serious enough that I needed emergency surgery, followed by an extended hospital stay, almost 2 weeks total, dealing with complications from the infection that had spread further than anyone initially realized. Silas was there throughout most of it, genuinely worried, genuinely present in the ways that mattered medically. But Adeline used that hospital stay, I discovered later, as an opportunity to insert herself into decisions about our house, our life, in ways that went far beyond anything reasonable, even accounting for genuine concern about my health. Here's what actually happened, pieced together slowly over the following weeks, through conversations with Silas, with Winona, and eventually, directly with Adeline herself. While I was still in the hospital, still recovering from surgery, still dealing with post-operative complications that kept me there far longer than anyone initially expected, Adeline had convinced Silas, during a period when he was exhausted, scared, and not thinking entirely clearly himself, that the house needed to be made safe before I came home, given what she characterized as my fragile mental state following such a traumatic medical experience. What made safe actually meant, in practice, was that Adeline had arranged for a locksmith to come change every exterior lock on our house, while Silas was at the hospital with me, using her own set of keys, which she had apparently obtained years earlier, under the guise of being a helpful emergency contact who might need access if we were ever traveling and needed someone to check on the house. She then, without informing me at all, distributed new keys selectively, one to herself, obviously, one to Silas, though even his access, I later learned, came with some strings attached that I'll get to. And, strangest of all, one to our neighbor Winona, along with specific instructions about under what circumstances Winona should actually let me back into my own home. I want you to really sit with that for a second, because when I first pieced it together, I genuinely couldn't believe what I was hearing. My mother-in-law had decided, unilaterally, while I was recovering from emergency surgery, that I might not be fit to simply walk back into my own house without someone else's approval first. The reasoning, once I finally got it directly from Adeline, in a conversation that happened about a week after that porch moment with Winona, was genuinely stunning in its audacity. "I was worried about your state of mind," she told me, sitting across from me at her own kitchen table, where I'd gone specifically to have this conversation face-to-face, rather than letting it fester through second-hand accounts and confused phone calls. "You'd been through such a traumatic surgery, and honestly, Adele, given everything with your anxiety this past year, I thought it made sense to have someone check that you were actually stable enough to be alone in that house again, rather than just letting you walk back in without anyone keeping an eye on things." Keeping an eye on things, I repeated slowly, trying to process the sheer scope of what she was describing. "Adeline, you changed the locks on a house I co-own. Without telling me you even had a key to begin with, actually, since I never gave you one." "Silas gave me one," she said, as though that settled the matter entirely. "Years ago, for emergencies." "This wasn't an emergency," I said. "I was recovering from surgery. That's not the same thing as being incapacitated, or dangerous to myself, or anyone else. You decided, on your own, that I needed some kind of gatekeeper before I could access my own home." She didn't seem to fully grasp, even as I laid it out that plainly, why this felt as violating as it did to me. "I was trying to protect you," she insisted. "And Silas, too. What if you'd come home and had some kind of breakdown, alone, with no one checking on you properly? Then Silas, my husband, who lives in that house with me, could have checked on me," I said. "That's what husbands do. That's not a decision that required you to unilaterally change the locks and appoint my next-door neighbor as some kind of mental fitness evaluator before allowing me back into my own home." I want to walk you through the conversation with Winona, too, because I think it matters for understanding just how far this whole situation had actually gone before I found out about any of it. Winona had lived next door to us for almost 3 years by that point, someone I considered a genuine friend, not just a neighbor. When Adeline approached her, apparently about a week into my hospital stay, with a spare key and specific instructions, Winona told me later she'd felt deeply uncomfortable with the whole request, but hadn't quite known how to push back against Silas's own mother, someone she'd met a handful of times at gatherings we'd hosted, presenting the situation with an urgency and authority that made it feel almost inappropriate to question. "She made it sound like it was already something you and Silas had discussed and agreed to," Winona told me, sitting in my kitchen a few days after that porch encounter, clearly still processing her own discomfort with having been pulled into the situation at all. She said something like, "Silas and I think it's best if someone checks on Adele's state of mind before she's just left alone in the house. And honestly, Adele, I assumed that meant you'd actually been part of that conversation somehow, even if you were in the hospital at the time. I had no idea you didn't know anything about this." I believed her completely, hearing the genuine distress in her voice. Winona hadn't done anything wrong here. Not really. She'd been placed in an impossible position by someone who'd deliberately framed the situation to make her feel like refusing would somehow be going against my own wishes, rather than actually protecting me from something I hadn't consented to at all. Now, here's where I need to talk about Silas, because his role in all of this is more complicated than either a simple villain or a simple victim narrative would suggest. When I confronted him directly, once I'd pieced together enough of the situation to understand roughly what had happened, he was clearly ashamed, genuinely so, in a way that told me he understood, at least in retrospect, how badly this had all gone. "I was exhausted," he said, sitting across from me in our living room, the same living room I hadn't been able to access for several days after coming home, thanks to his mother's decision. "You were so sick, Adele, sicker than I'd ever seen you, and my mom kept saying all this stuff about wanting to make sure you'd be safe when you came home, and I don't know, I wasn't thinking clearly enough to really push back the way I should have. She changed the locks on our house," I said. "Without asking me. Without even asking you, really, beyond convincing you in a moment when you were scared and exhausted. And then she gave a key to our neighbor, with instructions to evaluate my mental state before letting me into my own home. Do you understand how insane that is, when you actually say it out loud?" He did understand, eventually, once he heard it laid out plainly rather than filtered through his mother's framing of protective concern. But understanding it after the fact didn't undo the actual damage, the actual violation, of coming home from major surgery to find myself locked out of my own house, dependent on a neighbor's judgment call about whether I seemed stable enough to be granted access. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it matters for the full picture. I did have a difficult moment, standing on that porch, key not working, confusion turning into something closer to genuine panic as I started to understand what was actually happening. Winona later told me she'd been genuinely worried, in that moment, about whether letting me in immediately was actually the right call, given how distressed I clearly was, precisely because of the situation Adeline had put her in. That's the part that makes me angriest, honestly, even now, months later. Adeline's actions didn't just violate my access to my own home. They actively created the exact kind of distressing scenario that then made it seem, superficially, like her concerns about my mental state had been justified all along. A self-fulfilling situation where being locked out of my own house while recovering from surgery understandably caused real distress, which then got read, at least momentarily, as evidence supporting the very narrative that had caused the distress in the first place. I sat with all of this for about 2 weeks before deciding what I actually wanted to do, because this wasn't a situation where anger alone was going to lead me toward the right response. I needed to think clearly about what actual accountability and protection looked like going forward. I called a lawyer, a family law attorney named Beatrice Onyema, mostly just to understand my actual legal standing regarding the house itself, given that I was a co-owner who'd been effectively locked out of my own property. "Since you're on the deed jointly with your husband," Beatrice explained, "your mother-in-law had absolutely no legal authority to change locks or restrict your access to that property, regardless of any concerns she claims to have had about your well-being. What she did, frankly, could constitute a form of unlawful exclusion, or even, depending on how aggressively you wanted to pursue it, harassment, given the pattern of behavior you're describing. I'm not necessarily looking to sue my mother-in-law," I said. "I just want to understand what my actual options are, and I want this to never happen again." Beatrice helped me draft a formal letter, not necessarily threatening legal action outright, but making clear, in unambiguous legal language, that Adeline had no legal standing to access, modify, or restrict entry to a property she didn't own, and that any future attempt to do so would result in formal legal consequences. I delivered that letter myself, along with a face-to-face conversation that I made sure included Silas as well, since I needed him to understand clearly, in front of his mother, exactly where I stood on all of this. "I understand you were scared, and I understand you thought you were helping," I told Adeline, in that same kitchen where our earlier conversation had happened. "But what you actually did was violate my legal rights to my own home, based on your own private judgment about my mental fitness. Judgment you never once discussed directly with me. Going forward, you will never again have a key to our house, and if anything like this happens again, I will pursue this legally, without hesitation." She tried, initially, to push back, to reframe the situation once more as simple protective concern that I was somehow misunderstanding or overreacting to. But with Silas sitting there, having finally, fully absorbed just how serious this actually was, he backed me up in that moment in a way he hadn't quite managed to during the initial confusion right after I came home. "Mom, you can't do this again," he said, his voice firm in a way I genuinely needed to hear from him in that moment. "I should have stopped this from happening in the first place, and I didn't, because I wasn't thinking clearly. But what you did wasn't okay, and it's not going to happen again." Adeline eventually surrendered her key, though not without a fair amount of continued insistence that she'd only ever been trying to help, that we were both overreacting to what she still, even then, seemed to genuinely believe had been a reasonable precaution given the circumstances. Here's what actually changed in the months since all of this happened, because I think the aftermath matters as much as the initial confrontation. Silas and I went to couples counseling for a while, specifically to work through what this whole situation revealed about how he handled pressure from his mother, and how we needed to establish clearer boundaries going forward about decisions affecting our shared life together. It wasn't easy, honestly. There were sessions where old patterns clearly wanted to resurface, moments where I could tell some part of him still wanted to minimize what had happened as an overblown misunderstanding, rather than the genuine violation it actually was. But we worked through it, slowly, and I think, ultimately, came out the other side with a marriage that's more honest about these dynamics than it was before. My relationship with Adeline is significantly more distant now. We still see each other at family gatherings, still maintain a baseline level of civility for Silas's sake, but the closeness that maybe could have developed under different circumstances simply isn't there anymore, and honestly, I've made peace with that. Trust, once violated that specifically, and that seriously, doesn't just rebuild itself because enough time passes. Winona and I are actually closer now, strangely enough, similar to how difficult situations sometimes reveal genuine character. She's continued checking in on me regularly since all of this happened, not because anyone assigned her that role this time, but because we've built a real friendship out of what was initially an incredibly uncomfortable situation neither of us asked to be part of. My mental health, ironically, has actually improved significantly since all of this happened, though not because of anything Adeline did. My therapy has continued, my anxiety has become much more manageable through consistent treatment, and honestly, having clear, enforced boundaries around who has access to my own home and my own life has probably contributed more to my sense of stability than anything else that happened during that whole period. Sometimes I think about that moment on the porch, key not turning, confusion slowly curdling into something closer to genuine fear, before Winona came out with that spare key, and gently, awkwardly, explained a situation neither of us had asked to be part of. I think about how close that entire scenario came to reinforcing exactly the narrative Adeline had constructed, a genuinely distressing moment that could easily have been read, superficially, as confirmation of instability rather than what it actually was, which was a completely reasonable reaction to being illegally locked out of your own home during a vulnerable recovery period. I don't know what would have happened if Winona hadn't come out onto her porch right when she did, hadn't had the courage, even in her own discomfort with the whole situation, to actually hand me that key, rather than following Adeline's instructions to somehow evaluate my state of mind first. Maybe I'd have called Silas, panicked, standing outside my own home. Maybe the whole situation would have played out even worse than it already did. But Winona did come out, and because of her honesty, and because of the legal clarity I eventually got about my actual rights to that house, I ended up with something more valuable than just regained access to my own home. I got real clarity about exactly how far certain people in my life were willing to go, under the guise of protection, to control decisions that were never actually theirs to make. That's really the whole story, when I look back on it clearly. Not some dramatic courtroom battle, no screaming confrontation caught on camera. Just a key that didn't work, a neighbor caught in an impossible position, and a mother-in-law who had to finally learn, directly and without room for reinterpretation, that concern for someone's well-being never actually justifies deciding, unilaterally, that they no longer get access to their own life.